Forced labor in the supply chain. Joining us today to speak about that, Suzanne Offerman, Senior Product Marketing Manager for Onesource Global Trade at Thomson Reuters. Suzanne, it's great to see you. Welcome.
Thanks. Thank you, Russell. Thanks for talking.
Suzanne, let's talk, set the stage and talk about some of the greatest or biggest risks that supply chains are facing these days. Walk us through that as you see them. What's going on?
Sure. I think there are two main ones. The one we've seen most recently has been the sanctions, economic and export sanctions on Russia and Belarus because of the fighting that's going on there. So there's always a risk there. The companies might run afoul. But I think the most current risk, and the one that we're going to see the most of in the future, is the risk of forced labor in your supply chain. I think that's one of the biggest risks out there for companies that companies have been thinking about and may or may not be ready for.
Well, I want to get to the why of that question in just a moment, but I guess maybe we ought to define our terms here. What exactly does forced labor mean?
Sure. So forced labor is modern day slavery. It's when people are working and either not being paid fairly, being held against their will, being threatened in some way, but are forced to work in a factory, for example.
Is this a worldwide phenomenon?
It is. I think that when we talk about forced labor, we typically think of China because that's what's been in the news the most, but it actually does happen worldwide. I think virtually every continent there have been forced labor findings and for various products in various industries.
Well, then the question now is why? Why is forced labor one of the biggest risks that supply chains are going to be facing? I mean, isn't this something that, quite frankly, nobody has to engage in? So, what's the deal here?
So there are several reasons. First, there actually have been laws on the books for a very long time in most of the major economies that you'd expect, including the United States, for decades even. But there is a new law that was passed in December of last year called the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And that law has a bit more teeth in it. The regulations are expected to come out later this month. So I think that that's probably what's driving a lot of the interest now in taking a look at it. The risk, though, aside, of course, running afoul of a statute, right, is that what it's expecting companies to do. So companies will typically know their direct suppliers well, their vendors well. They may even know their tier 2 suppliers, right? But once you go past that, your tier 3, 4, 5, supply chains are extremely long, subcontractors, etc. That's when it becomes more problematic because the way the statute is written and the way the regulations are expected, if anything, of part of your product is made out of within a certain region of China, which in the Xinjiang region in China, for example, which is where the law is focused, it's presumed to be made with forced labor. So we're talking like the cotton, like picking the cotton, literally. If you can't trace it back, then you find that it's made, into the clothing that a company is importing. It's presumed to have been made with forced labor. Under the new rules, which are coming out later this month, under the statute, there's a rebuttable presumption, which means that they will be publishing a list of companies that have been, assumed have been made or using forced labor in their supply chain, known or unknowingly, doesn't matter. That's also one of the biggest risks that are out there, like that change. But even if we didn't have this new law coming out, under even some of the old laws, right, there's withhold release orders that are issued, across the globe, really, where your goods can be held. Under the new law, your goods can be detained. And it's extremely difficult once you're in that position to get your goods back. So typically, it's high legal fees, loss of goods, reputational risk, etc. So companies have, significant risk. They have to be careful of running afoul of the statute. They need to be sure that they're making their customers happy, right, who care about these types of issues. They need to make their shareholders happy, who care about these type of issues. And I think in the law themselves, they're supposed to remediate if they see the problem. They should report or at least stop making goods where they found it.
All right, I want to make sure I understand this clearly. You mean to tell me that if I am unaware that my supplier is sourcing cocoa from Cote d'Ivoire or some other place in West Africa in unsafe, essentially slavery conditions, or if I am sourcing apparel in some unsafe sweatshop in Bangladesh, I'm going to be held responsible for that? Is that what you're telling me?
That's what I'm telling you. So it's not enough to know who you are contracting with. You need to know who they are contracting with. You need to know all the tiers, really to the nth tier, if you will.
Okay, so I need to be proactive, to these conditions. So walk me through that. How do I do that?
Sure. So there are some ways to at least mitigate your risk, right? One simple one, you need to assess who you're doing business with. You need to assess your vendors. You need to send them questionnaires to make sure that you know all of them. So not just a pre-selected few, right? You can go by your tiers, maybe start with your tier 1 and then move down the chain. You can also protect yourself contractually, with your suppliers as well. I think you need to determine your higher risk areas. So there's going to be some products that are higher risk than others, some regions or industries that are higher risk than others. So you can take a look at that. And then I think what happens is you can screen your customers, right? There's lots of screening tools out there, if you will, to make sure that you're not doing business with somebody who's on a restricted list somewhere, for example. And then the timing is important, right? So the key is you want to be able to screen your suppliers before you're in business with them, right? Ideally, you want to find it as early as you can. If you find it later, you want to be able to remediate it, report it, and companies have done that. If companies have found it, some have taken the approach of, I'm going to come out and tell everybody, and I'm not going to do business there anymore.
Okay, so you mentioned the technology, so I want to drill down on that just a bit here. Talk to me about the technology that's going to help me avoid this situation. What does a good technology solution look like if I'm interested in, doing the right thing?
Sure. So there's a few components. I think one is you need to have real-time regulatory information. So you don't want to find out that there's been a regulatory change of some sort a week later. You need it the next day, that day. And so you want to look for a solution that has large regulatory content, one that has a large staff that is monitoring daily, giving your updates daily, so that you're informed, your team is informed, and for this issue, more importantly, so that you can then tell your superiors, right? You want to make sure you're telling the people that are making the decisions that it exists. I think another is goes against knowing your partners. So I mentioned before denied party screening. I think you need to screen early, screen often. I think you need tools that are like questionnaire type tools so that you can assess the vendor risk. So when you assess the vendor risk, you then can marry it up with the type of product and then determine where your highest risk is. So therefore, you're letting the software inform your decision about where you need feet on the ground. Because at some point, you might want to send somebody to take a look, for example, at a factory to see what's going on there. And then, there's a lot of emerging technologies out there, right, to try to help you connect the dots. I know that government agencies, for example, are looking at various solutions, as well. And I think that the key that I always remember when I talk about this issue is the part about remediation. So the technology is very important. I think all of that makes sense. But I do feel like there's, a bit of an obligation to make sure that if you see it, to report it, and really to try to do something about it.
This is useful information, but something that I imagine some of the viewers want to have, in addition to what you said, is a little information about your company. So if you would tell us, what is Thomson Reuters all about? What is Onesource Global Trade all about? And how does it help your customer base? What do you say?
Sure. Well, I'm happy to tell you. So Onesource Global Trade is a suite of global trade management products, part of, the Thomson Reuters, product of suites. And what we have is we have global trade content, trade compliance solutions, risk reduction solutions in your supply chain, duty optimization solutions, trade learning, all for multinational corporations that are involved in global trade.
All right, all right. I think you may just have helped somebody today stay out of trouble. Thank you so much for finding the time to speak with us. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Russell. Nice to talk to you.
Suzanne Offerman, Thomson Reuters, and speaking with us today about forced labor in the supply chain, how you can avoid becoming involved. Thanks for watching.